Hello. Well, as you can see, I am not in the garden today, and in all likelihood over the winter period I will do one or two videos indoors. Now, like many gardeners at this time of year, I'm thinking about what I'm going to be sowing and growing next season, and I've got a mountain of seeds here from various companies that have been coming in over the last, well, probably 2 months or so. I like to get ahead and get those on order in good time, just in case there are any supply issues. I've got one or two yet to arrive, and then I'll probably do one or two videos on what I plan to cultivate next year. But in this video, I wanted to share with you a few thoughts on planning and just show what I do to plan my crops for next year. So there's nothing clever about this at all, but there's one tool that I found really useful. So for most years, I haven't done any planning whatsoever. When we first created the kitchen garden, I laid it out in great detail, sometimes on paper, other times on some CAD programs, and everything was laid out to the nearest millimeter. And that was really helpful. Planning at that stage when you're constructing beds and deciding where big items like a greenhouse or a polytunnel go, it's well worth spending time laying that out very carefully and thinking through how that's going to work in practice. But as for the sort of day-to-day sowing and growing, I've tended to do no planning whatsoever. Well, I'm not new to growing fruit and veg, so I've just done it in an ad hoc manner. And it's okay, but it's not always great, because inevitably there'll be something I've forgotten to sow, something I haven't thought about, or I'm going to be a little bit late with something, and it would be much better if I did at least a tiny amount of planning. Then instead of just every couple of weeks working my way through the box of seeds, seeing what I could sow that week. I mean, it's fine to do it like that, and I've done it like that for years, but I could do better. So this last season, I thought I would plan in a little more detail. And well, about, I suppose it's probably 18 months ago now, I was looking around at tools that were available to help with the planning. And there are lots of them, whether it's for a desktop machine or apps for tablets or phones. There are lots of tools out there that could be used. And I got one of what I think is probably one of the better ones. I won't say what tool I was using, because that's probably a little unfair, because I haven't trialed more of them. I've just tried that one, and I thought I'd get a trial version of it and give it a go. So I downloaded something where you can draw out your entire plot, and you can plan where the crops are going and when. I have to be honest, I was most unimpressed. I think those sorts of tools have a problem. And I think it's because on the one hand, they are too sophisticated, and on the other hand, they are not nearly sophisticated enough. So what I mean by that is that those tools force you to plan at a fairly low level. You can draw in your beds that are supposedly the exact size that they are in practice, and then you can drop the crops in at certain times of year, and it will tell you how many plants you've got at certain spacings and so on, and it will generate a list of plants that you need to produce. That all sounds great, But I found that there were lots of limitations with at least that program that I tried. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of the other tools that are available have similar limitations. So you could decide what crops would go in throughout the season, but only month by month. You couldn't say drop something in the plan in mid-March and take it out in mid-June. That simply wasn't possible. And then, even though you were dropping plants on the plan at certain times of the year, it wouldn't generate for you a sowing list, which is the most important thing. I mean, in terms of planning, there are only two issues really: what to sow and when, and then where to put it once it's come up. If you're sowing direct, that you'll be dealing with that all in one go. I do a lot of sowing in cell trays or seed trays or pots, and so I'm transplanting a lot of the time. And for a lot of plants, I do prefer to do it that way. So it's not helpful to just be able to say, well, I want a plant in the ground at a certain time. I need a reminder of when I should be sowing those plants so that they're ready at the right time of year for transplanting. I really had to wrestle with just laying out our plot in this tool. I'm used to CAD programs, so I assumed I would have at least some of the tools that you would be used to from that world, but they were really primitive, the tools available to lay out the plot, and I really had to wrestle with it to get things in at the right sizes. If the tool is going to tell you how many plants you need at a certain spacing, then the bed that you put in there really ought to be exactly the right size. Otherwise you're getting the wrong information. That was a bit of a nightmare. And then it couldn't really cope with the detailed level of planning that I think those tools aspire to. So I didn't find that particularly helpful, and I think if a tool is going to be helpful for the gardener, then there are a few fairly basic requirements, and one is that it cannot be burdensome. It's no good if you need to sit down every week and spend an hour updating the plan and fiddling around with it. That's time that you really want to be spending in the garden. And it also has to be really rather flexible, because gardening is a reactive process. We don't decide ahead of time that we're going to sow something on a particular day, or very rarely do we decide we're going to sow something on a particular day months ahead. You just can't do that. You have to see how the weather's doing. If there's a warm period, you might bring the sowing date forward. If it's still too cold, you'll push it back. So it's no good if every time you make a small change to your sowing plan, you have to spend hours updating the plan on the tool. I just felt that I would never get around to keeping it up to date. And actually, there's no real reason for your tool to work at that fine granularity. I don't think that's particularly helpful. So I was a little bit disappointed with the planning tools, and I'd spent quite a lot of time looking on the internet at what people are using and what tools are available, and I decided I don't like any of them. But there is one thing I found really useful, and that is a simple spreadsheet with the varieties that I'm planning to sow and a rough idea of when I want to do it. So I thought I'd just show you the spreadsheet I'm using. As the new seeds have been coming in, I've been adding the varieties onto that spreadsheet. And this one, I think, it's at the right sort of level. It's very quick and easy to use. It's absolutely not burdensome at all. And every week or two, I can open the spreadsheet up and just scroll down the list of varieties and see whether I need to be thinking about sowing any of them. And that's been a really big help to me in the previous season, and I'm going to be using it again next year. So let's take a look. Right, so here I have a fairly simple spreadsheet, and of course you could do this with pen and paper or even use a calendar. It's not a bad way to do it, but I find the spreadsheet quite convenient, and of course it's easy to edit. So if we take a look at this, on the left hand side here I have 3 columns, and in the first column I've got plant families or groupings. So here I've got brassicas, then the beets, then roots, the nightshades, the legumes, alliums, and then various leaves. So here I've kind of departed from the strict family groupings, but this is crops that I want for their leaves, and then I'm back to families with the cucurbits, and then I've got herbs and various other bits and bobs. So I've got the broad categories there, and then in the second column I've got particular crops. So the brassicas, of course, is a really big one. It probably accounts for half of the plantings in the garden here. So I've got cabbages, calabrese, broccoli, and so on. I've also got these split according to sowing period. So for the cabbage, also for the cauliflower and oriental greens, I've got those that you would sow potentially early in the year, and those that you would sow probably someone after midsummer. So taking the oriental greens, for example, most of those don't appreciate hot conditions. So although you could do a particularly early sowing, it's best to wait until towards the end of summer, at least after midsummer, to sow those. But there are a few here that you can sow in the spring as well, and so I've got those separated, different categories there, and the reason for that will become clear in a moment. And then on to the third column. Well, here I list the specific varieties that I'm growing. Most of the time I'm listing individual varieties. Occasionally I've got some grouped together. That's particularly true of things like the tomatoes, the chilies, and the peppers here, because I will be sowing all of those together at the same time. So there's no reason for me to list those separately. There are a few things where I don't have varieties listed. So for example, the runner bean at the moment, I'm not planning to grow any next year. I tend to prefer the French beans. Some years I grow some runners as well, but not this time. And here, for example, with the garlic, I haven't listed the specific varieties, and there's no need for me to list them in all cases. But most of the seeds that I've got now have been added to this list. And then we come to the business end of the spreadsheet with these columns here. So I've got 2 columns for each month, and I find that that is sufficient granularity. And if I want to sow a particular crop, if I'm planning to sow something, I will just put a mark in the corresponding cell. So here, for example, I've got Copenhagen Market. That's a summer or autumn cabbage, and I tend to make a pretty early start on those. So I've got my cross here in the first part of February. Given the vagaries of the weather and the fact that no 2 seasons are alike, I don't think it's very useful to pin down the sowing point any closer than that. But of course you could divide this into 3. You could have early February, mid-February, late February. That might work quite well. Or you could divide this down into weeks if you really wanted to. But I think it's enough for me to know that in early February, I want to get one of these cabbages sown. This plan is still a work in progress, so I've got lots of stuff that I've just blocked in at the moment with sowing times, and these may well be staggered, or I might move them about. The other thing that I found quite handy is to mark on this chart the typical sowing times for the various crops. And then I can see when I am pushing the boundaries slightly. So for example, if we scroll down to Cima di Rapa, I have two sorts that I'll be growing, a 40-day and a 90-day variety. I mean, those are nominal times to harvest. And Cima di Rapa, it doesn't particularly like the hot weather. It will grow best under cool conditions. So the normal sowing period is probably something from the latter half of June. So maybe after midsummer through to the end of September. That's probably a reasonable period in which to sow that. So these cells have been highlighted in green. And so when I'm planning out the crops, I don't have to think about when should I really be sowing these. This is permanently marked on this spreadsheet. And when I come and do this again next year with potentially different varieties, I know what the usual sowing period is for that crop. But you can see on this occasion with the 40-day variety, I am sowing well outside of this sort of conventional period. Now, you can see further down for the beetroots that I'm planning a reasonably late sowing. I mean, that may be pushed even further, but if I'm just a little bit outside the green band, that's probably quite reasonable. I know that if I'm miles outside like I am here, I'm doing something slightly unusual. But I tried this year, and I know that if I make a really early sowing in one of the cold frames, I can do that in February, and I can get that crop out by the end of April, hopefully, or into early May, just in time for that cold frame to be used for melons or other summer crops. So I think I can get away with an early sowing there. And this chart helps me to organize my thoughts on exactly when I'm going to sow these things. Now, these green bands here, you can get that information from all sorts of sources. You can get it, of course, from gardening books online, and there are lots of calendars and timelines that various people have produced. And of course, you can get it from the seed packets and from the guidance offered by the seed merchant. So it's a little bit of a chore to go through each of these crops and put in these traditional sowing periods. You can see, for example, here why I've split up the summer and autumn cabbages from the winter and spring, because the sowing periods are different. But once you've done that, you only have to do that once, and then this chart can be reused year after year. At the moment, all I do is mark the approximate sowing periods with a cross here. And I could, of course, extend this and add far more information into these cells. But I find that this is probably enough to keep me on track. So every time I go down the garden to make a sowing, I can just open up this spreadsheet and scroll down through the list and just see what should be sown round about now. So my first sowings in February, they're going to be some of the brassicas, and depending on weather conditions, these sowings, they'll probably happen in the first half of February, but if conditions dictate, they'll move to the second half. And I may update the plan as things change, or I might just leave it as it is, but just every time I go to sow something, scroll down and just look at where I've got the markings here and what might be suitable to sow at that time. If we've got a really warm end of winter, some of these from late February, they might be brought forward and so on. But I think this is enough for me, having grown in that garden for quite some years now. This is enough of a reminder of what I'm planning to sow and roughly when I want to do it. So that's the tool that I've decided to adopt for planning my crops for next year. There's really nothing clever about it, but it is dead handy. Now, there are those two aspects to your garden plan. The one is what you're going to sow and when. The other aspect is where you're going to put it. So that first aspect, that's dealt with by the spreadsheet. The second part, where on the plot the plants are eventually going to go. To be honest, I don't think that is a particularly important area to plan. So if you've been working your plot for a few years, I think that you'll probably have a pretty good idea where everything's going to go. If you're new to it, then a certain level of planning might be beneficial. But I think after a few years, I think you'll find that you no longer have to worry about where crops are going. You'll have the experience of how much you can fit in and where you want to put them. So in my own garden, I've got fairly well defined areas of planting. I've got the main beds that are part of a rotation, so I know what crop families are going in those beds. And then I've got the borders, and those are large areas of planting. And again, I don't necessarily know specifically where each and every plant is going, but I know what the large blocks of bed are going to be used for. And I don't think there's any need for me at this stage to be planning that out. However, if you do want to have an idea on paper as where things are going to go, then it's very simple to replace the marks on the spreadsheet to indicate the sowing points. You can easily put a label in there instead, draw out a plan with all of your beds on, divide them up into appropriately sized chunks, just label them up, and then you can mark on the sowing plan exactly where they're going to go. And if you wanted to, you can also add, maybe you'd put 2 rows for each variety, and you would mark on there both the sowing time and the time that you plant out. So there's scope there to extend this as far as you want to go into more detail and potentially link it to a plan of your plot. But for me, I don't think that's going to be particularly helpful, and it would probably be more of a burden. But I can imagine that if I started a new plot, then I would want to think a lot more carefully about where everything is going for the first few years. So it's quite easy to extend this if you need to. But anyway, I just thought I'd share with you that simple tool that I use for planning. But that is all for this video. Thanks very much for watching.